There is a woman in the 4th chapter of 2 Kings who is introduced in a single sentence and whose name is never recorded. The Bible calls her simply the Shunammite woman, identified only by the town she came from, Shunem, a small settlement in the Jezreel Valley in northern Israel. She is wealthy, the text tells us. She is prominent in some translations, great in others, the Hebrew word suggesting a person of substance and standing in her community. And that is all the introduction we get before the story begins. She never gives a speech. She never leads an army. She never prophesies or performs a miracle or receives a direct commission from God. She doesn't have a platform. She doesn't have a title. She doesn't build a ministry or establish a movement or leave behind a theological contribution that would be debated for centuries. She builds a small room on the roof of her house. She furnishes it with 4 pieces of furniture, and she changes everything. But before she builds anything, she does something that the text presents as the foundation of everything that follows. Something that sounds simple and is actually quite rare. She notices. The prophet Elisha passed through Shunem regularly. His ministry took him up and down the length of Israel, from the Jordan Valley to Mount Carmel and back. And the road through Shunem was part of his regular circuit, which means that for some period of time before this story begins, Elisha had been passing through this woman's town on a recurring basis, walking the same road, perhaps stopping at the same well, being seen by the same townspeople who had grown accustomed to his presence as a familiar feature of their landscape. Most of them, presumably, saw him the way we see the regular features of our own landscapes. The mail carrier, the neighbor who walks his dog at the same time every morning, the familiar face that passes your window while you are making coffee. You register the presence without attending to it. It becomes part of the background. You stop really seeing it because you have seen it enough times that your mind has categorized it as known and moved on to something more pressing. The Shunammite woman did not do this. Every time Elisha passed, she saw him. Not just registered his presence, but genuinely attended to it. And at some point, the text doesn't tell us exactly when, whether it was the first time or the 5th or the 15th. She came to a conclusion that nobody else around her appears to have reached. She said to her husband, "I perceive that this is a holy man of God who is continually passing our way." I perceive. That word is doing significant work. It is not the language of casual observation or immediate recognition. It is the language of a conclusion reached over time through sustained attention. She had been watching. She had been thinking about what she observed. She had been processing the quality of the man, the nature of his presence, something that distinguished him from the ordinary travelers who passed through Shunem on their way to somewhere else. And she had arrived at a specific, confident, spiritually discerning conclusion: this man carries something holy. He is not just a traveler. He is a man of God. The ability to perceive this about Elisha was itself a form of spiritual gift, not the dramatic kind that announces itself with power and visible manifestation, the quiet kind, the kind that comes from paying attention when the world has given you permission to look away, the kind that requires slowing down enough to actually see what is in front of you, rather than processing it quickly and filing it under already known. Think about what this woman was doing with her attention in those moments when Elisha passed. She was not scrolling through anything. She was not managing competing demands on her focus. She was simply present enough, attentive enough, spiritually awake enough to register that the man walking past her house was carrying something that the world around her was too busy or too familiar to notice. And this act of noticing, this willingness to pay the kind of sustained, genuine attention to the world around her that most of us rarely manage, was the beginning of everything that followed. She could not have built the room if she had not first perceived who Elisha was. She could not have served him if she had not first seen him. And she would not have received the miracle she never asked for if she had not first practiced the discipline of actually looking at the person passing by her door. The American church is moving through an era of extraordinary noise and extraordinary distraction. The feed is always moving. The notifications are always arriving. The demands on our attention are multiplying faster than our capacity to manage them. And in the middle of all of this, the spiritual discipline that the Shunammite woman practiced, the discipline of stopping, attending, perceiving the holy in the ordinary, recognizing what God has placed in the path of your daily life, has become one of the rarest and most countercultural practices available. But every great act of service in Scripture begins with this. Moses noticed the burning bush rather than walking past it. The disciples noticed Jesus standing on the shore of Galilee. The Good Samaritan noticed the man in the ditch when everyone else had found reasons not to see him. The Shunammite woman noticed Elisha, and in the noticing, a door opened that no amount of pious intention without attentiveness could have opened. She did something else after the noticing that is worth pausing on. She acted on what she perceived. She didn't simply register the holiness she had discerned and then continue about her day, gratified by her own spiritual sensitivity. She took the perception and translated it immediately into hospitality. She urged Elisha to stop and eat. The word in Hebrew carries the sense of persistence, of pressing. She didn't offer once and accept a polite decline. She insisted. She made space at her table for the man she had been watching and come to understand was carrying something from God. This movement from noticing to acting, from perceiving to providing, is the complete motion of what genuine spiritual attentiveness looks like in practice. It is not sufficient to recognize the holy in the ordinary if the recognition produces nothing but a warm interior feeling. The Shunammite woman's perception found its completion in action. She saw, and then she served. She discerned, and then she moved. And the movement was the thing that made everything else possible. There are people in your life right now who are passing your door. Some of them are carrying things from God, a need, a calling, a weariness in the service of something larger than themselves that your attentiveness could recognize and your hospitality could address. The question the Shunammite woman's story asks of every person watching this is simply, are you looking? Are you present enough to the ordinary landscape of your daily life to perceive the holy that is moving through it? Are you paying the kind of attention that leads to action rather than the kind of awareness that produces only observation? She noticed. She acted. And a story began that would involve a room and a child and a death and a resurrection, and a faithfulness that God would honor in ways the woman could not have imagined when she first stopped to urge a passing prophet to come inside and eat. She went to her husband with a proposal, and the proposal is in many ways the most instructive part of the entire story. More instructive even than the miracle that comes later, because the miracle reveals what God can do. The proposal reveals what kind of person this woman was at the level of her ordinary daily choices. And the kind of person she was at that level is precisely why the miracle found her. She said, "Let us make a small room on the roof with walls, and let us put there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, so that whenever he comes to us, he can go in there." 4 items: a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp. That is the complete furnishing plan for the room she intended to build. No luxury, no attempt to impress, no addition of items that would announce the wealth and status of the household providing them. Just the 4 things that a person needs to rest, to work, to sit, and to see in the dark. The minimum required for genuine comfort. The essentials of human habitation offered without any excess that might communicate something about the giver rather than simply serving the recipient. The restraint in this list is as significant as the generosity. She was not building a showroom. She was not creating a demonstration of what her household could afford. She was building what Elisha needed, and only that. with the kind of practical, unsentimental attention to actual need, rather than impressive provision that characterizes service, that is genuinely oriented toward the other person, rather than toward the giver's own sense of virtue. And she was going to build it on the roof, the upper chamber, a space deliberately set apart from the household's daily life, giving the prophet privacy and quiet and separation from the ordinary noise and traffic of a busy household. She was not simply making room at a crowded table. She was creating a dedicated space, a space that existed specifically and entirely for the purpose of this man's rest and work and prayer. A room that would have no other function. A room whose every feature announced, "You are expected here. This is yours. You do not need to be a guest in someone else's space. You have a place that has been made for you." This is the deepest form of hospitality. Not the hospitality that accommodates that, moves things around to make room, that says we can fit you in if you don't mind a little crowding, but the hospitality that prepares that, creates something new specifically for the person being served. That says we thought about you before you arrived, and we built something with you in mind. The investment required to build that room was real. Stone and labor and time and planning and the ongoing cost of maintaining it. This was not a spontaneous gesture. It was a considered, deliberate, sustained commitment to the ongoing provision of a specific person's needs. She wasn't feeding Elisha once out of impulse and then returning to her normal life. She was restructuring her household, literally, architecturally, to make his periodic presence a permanent feature of her life and her home. And she did all of this without any indication that she expected anything in return. The text gives us no hint of strategic motivation, no suggestion that she was building a room for a prophet, because she was hoping the prophet's blessing would produce some particular outcome she was working toward. No whisper of the transactional calculus that so often underlies even our most apparently generous acts. The subterranean awareness that generosity tends to produce return, that kindness to the right people tends to circle back in useful ways. None of that appears in the text. What appears is simply a woman who perceived a need and moved to meet it with her whole house. The room she built was small. The text emphasizes this: small walls, small room, a rooftop chamber rather than a grand wing. She was not giving beyond her means in a way that would strain the household. She was giving within her means in a way that was complete and ungrudging. The smallness of the room is not a limitation of her generosity. It is evidence of its genuineness. She was building what was needed, not what would look impressive. She was serving the man, not constructing a monument to her own virtue. This is the kind of giving that God notices. Not the giving that is large enough to announce itself. Not the gift that requires the recipient to acknowledge the magnitude of what has been done for them. Not the service that is performed in a way that ensures the served person understands the cost to the server. But the giving that is sized to the actual need. Practical, thoughtful, oriented entirely toward the recipient's actual comfort rather than the giver's image. Consider the 4 pieces of furniture again: a bed, a table, a chair, a lamp. Every single item represents an understanding of Elisha's real life and real needs. The bed says, "I know you are tired. You are walking these roads constantly. This ministry is physically demanding, and you need genuine rest." The table says, "I know you have work to do, scrolls to read, prayers to write, thoughts to organize. You need a surface." The chair says, "I know that rest for you is not only lying down, but sitting still, having a place to simply be present without moving." The lamp says, "I know your work continues after dark. I am not going to ask you to stop when the sun goes down because my household goes dark. The light is provided. Stay as long as you need." 4 pieces of furniture. 4 precise attentions to the shape of a prophet's life. She had been watching long enough to understand what he needed, and she built exactly that. There is something here for every person who has felt that their capacity for service was too small or too ordinary to matter in the larger economy of God's work. The Shunammite woman did not have an impressive ministry. She did not have the kind of calling that announces itself on a stage or a platform. She had a house. She had a husband who was willing to support her impulse toward generosity. She had the ability to observe what someone needed and the practical intelligence to provide it. And she had the willingness to make a permanent change to her household in order to serve one person well. That is enough. It has always been enough. The small room becomes the holy ground. The 4 pieces of furniture become the furnishing of a space where God does something that the whole elaborate temple apparatus could not produce. She built a room for a man of God, and God in return built something in her life that she had not dared to ask for. But before we get to what God built, we need to stay for a moment in the room itself. In its smallness, in its sufficiency, in its 4 pieces of carefully chosen furniture arranged by hands that expected nothing back. Because the room is the whole story, really. The miracle is just the room's response. And the room is ordinary enough to be the beginning of everything. Elisha was grateful. The text shows him thinking about her, thinking about what could be done for this woman who had gone to such lengths, such quiet and practical lengths, to care for him. He set his servant Gehazi to find out what he could do in return. And here is where the Shunammite woman reveals something about herself that is as rare and as significant as the room she built. Gehazi asked her, "You have gone to all this trouble for us. What can be done for you? Can we speak on your behalf to the king or the commander of the army?" She said, "I dwell among my own people. Nothing is needed. Thank you, but no." She was not being falsely modest. She was not performing the social ritual of declining in order to be pressed harder. The text does not give us any indication of strategic self-deprecation or manufactured humility. She had built the room because she perceived a need, and she had the means to meet it. She was not keeping a record that required settling. She genuinely had no request to make. The giving had been complete in itself. The room was the point. She had done what she wanted to do, and she did not experience its completion as the creation of a debt owed to her. This is the purest form of service that exists. The form that is given so completely to the other person's need that when the question of return is raised, the giver honestly has nothing to request. Not because she was suppressing her desires out of virtue, but because the giving had been genuinely free, unattached to any anticipated return, given in a way that its completion was its own fullness. She dwelt among her own people. She had what she needed. The community was intact. The household was functioning. Life was good. She was not engineering a transaction through her generosity, and the absence of a return request is the evidence that no transaction had been intended. Gehazi went back to Elisha and told him what she had said. And then Gehazi added the piece of information that the woman had not offered herself, the piece that she may not have consciously acknowledged, even to her own heart as a source of pain or longing. He said, "She has no son, and her husband is old." She had no son. In the ancient world, and in the specific context of this woman's culture, childlessness was not merely a personal grief. It was a social vulnerability, a future insecurity, a gap in the household story that carried both private sorrow and public weight. A woman without children was a woman without a certain kind of future, without the ongoing presence in the world that children represent, without the particular joy that the culture around her defined as one of the primary goods available to a woman's life. She had not mentioned this to Elisha. She had not made it part of her conversation with Gehazi when he came to ask what she needed. She had said, "I'd dwell among my own people," and left it there. But Elisha heard it from Gehazi, and he understood something that the woman had not said, and perhaps had trained herself not to fully feel that beneath the contentment and the generosity and the fully functioning goodness of her life, there was a place that had not been filled, a place she had probably stopped praying for, a place she had arranged her heart around as a permanent absence, rather than an active grief, the way we learn to live with the shapes of things that will not change. And Elisha sent for her. "Call her," he said. And when she stood in the doorway of that rooftop room she had built, standing at the threshold of the small space she had created for him with nothing in mind but his comfort, he said, "About this time next year, you will embrace a son." The response she gave to this announcement is one of the most honest and most moving responses to a divine promise in all of Scripture. She said, "No, my Lord, man of God, do not lie to your servant. Do not lie to your servant." She was not being impudent. She was not accusing Elisha of deception. She was telling him with complete honesty where she was. She was telling him that she had been in the place of this particular hope long enough that she had stopped being able to afford it, that the hope itself had become too painful to carry, that to let it rise again was to risk a devastation that she had already survived once and could not survive again. She was not saying, "I don't believe you are capable of delivering on this promise." She was saying, "I have protected myself from the pain of hoping for this by learning to live without it. And I am asking you to let me stay in the safety of that accommodation rather than opening the wound of longing that I have carefully closed. Do not lie to your servant." It is the words of a woman who has been hurt by hope before and has built a life around not being hurt by it again. And into that specific, honest, self-protecting response, God spoke the most personal and most targeted promise available. Not a general assurance of divine favor or a broad blessing on the household, but the specific, child-shaped answer to the specific, child-shaped wound that she had never brought to anyone and had never brought to God in any prayer that she expected to be answered. God heard what she never said. He responded to what she never asked. He set a promise into the exact location of the wound she had learned to not call a wound. This is the God of Scripture. Not only the God who answers what we bring to him, though he is that, but also the God who sees what we have stopped bringing, who attends to the griefs we have decided to manage rather than pray about, who notices the space between what we have and what we dared not ask for. The Shunammite woman built a room for Elisha and never asked for anything in return. And in that unrequesting, unself-conscious generosity, she gave God an occasion to demonstrate something about his character that her best and most strategic petition could never have produced. He is the God who answers the prayers we have stopped praying. He is the God who sees the empty rooms we have stopped furnishing with hope. He is the God who, when we have arranged our hearts around the permanent absence of something we once longed for, walks through the door of our service and says, "About this time next year, you will embrace what you stopped asking for." Do not lie to your servant. It is also the most permission-giving response in Scripture, because if she had smiled graciously and said, "Of course, thank you, that would be wonderful," if she had performed the expected, grateful acceptance of a spiritual gift, without letting Elisha see where she actually was, the encounter would have remained at the surface. Her honesty pulled it deeper. Her "do not lie to your servant" told Elisha everything he needed to know about the size of the wound that the promise was being sent to heal. And that honesty, the honesty of a woman who had built an entire room out of generosity and could not build a sentence out of polite performance, is part of what makes this story so extraordinary. Be honest with God about where you are. He already knows. But the honesty opens something that performance keeps closed. The next year came, and the promise came with it. She conceived and bore a son at that time the following spring, as Elisha had said. The text delivers the fulfillment of the promise in a single sentence, without drama or elaboration, in the same quiet register as the rest of this woman's story. No angelic announcement, no public ceremony, no lengthy narration of the pregnancy or the birth or the first days of the child's life. Simply, she conceived and she bore a son. And it was at the time that Elisha had told her it would be. The promise was kept. The word of the man of God proved true. And the woman who had said, "Do not lie to your servant," was holding what she had stopped daring to ask for. Think about that moment. Think about the precise experience of receiving something you had trained your heart not to want. Something you had protected yourself against by deciding that the wanting itself was too costly. Something you had arranged your life around the absence of, and then having that very thing placed in your arms. The joy of it is particular and almost indescribable. It is not simply the joy of getting something good. It is the joy of a wound being healed that you had accepted as permanent. It is the joy of discovering that the accommodation you had made with disappointment was not, as it turned out, final. It is the joy of being surprised by the goodness of a God you had quietly given up expecting to surprise you. She had not asked for this child. She had built the room and served the prophet and said, "I dwell among my own people with genuine contentment." And God had looked beneath the contentment and found the sorrow she had learned not to name. And he had answered it. Not because she had petitioned, not because she had presented her need in the right format with the right level of faith, but because she had served faithfully without agenda. And in that faithless of agenda service, she had created the conditions in which God could demonstrate the fullness of who he is. A God who sees what is not brought to him and responds to what is not asked. The child grew. The text gives us almost nothing about these years, except what we can infer from a few details. That the boy was old enough to go out to his father in the fields. That he was active and present in the life of the household. That he was clearly central to everything his mother's life had become in the years since his birth. He was not just a child. He was the living embodiment of the fact that God had heard what she never said. Every day he grew older was another day the promise was being extended. Every year of his life was another year of evidence that the God who had seen her faithfulness and known her grief was also the God who keeps the words he speaks. And this is the particular quality of this child that makes what is about to happen to him so devastating and so specifically aimed at the most vulnerable place in this woman's life. He was not simply her son. He was her testimony. He was the proof that had been placed in her arms of a God who rewards hidden faithfulness and answers unspoken prayers. To lose him would not only be to lose a child, though that alone would be loss beyond measure. It would be to watch the evidence of God's personal attention to her life go silent. It would be to have the living proof of divine faithfulness cold in her arms. But that is still chapters away. For now, the child is alive. The household is full of the particular noise and energy that a growing boy brings into a house. And the woman who had once built a small room with a bed and a table and a chair and a lamp to honor the passing presence of a prophet now had a child running through the rooms that the prophet's blessing had filled with life. The room she built had become the occasion for the life she was now living. The small four-furnishings act of faithful service had been answered by something so large and so personal that it still made her breath catch years later. Every time she looked at her son and understood what it had cost her not to ask for him, and what it had meant, that God had given him anyway. There is a word here that we need to carry forward into the harder chapters that are coming. The child she received was not simply a reward for her generosity. He was not a transaction you gave the room, God gave the son. He was a revelation, a living demonstration of the specific kind of God who was present in her life, the kind who pays attention to the small, faithfully performed, expectation-free acts of service that people do in obscurity and rewards them, not with what they strategically earned, but with what they privately needed. He was the answer to the question, what kind of God is this? And the answer, living in her arms and running through her house, was the kind who sees what you do in secret, and who knows what you carry in silence, and who does not wait for you to formulate the correct petition before he moves to meet the deepest need you have. She had a son. The room had been built. The prophet had come and gone and come again through the seasons, and everything seemed to be in the kind of order that sometimes, in the kindest seasons of a life, feels like it could be permanent, like it could just stay this way. Like the story might have reached a place of rest from which no more difficult chapters would need to be written. It didn't stay that way. It never does. And what happened next on an ordinary morning in the harvest fields, with the sun already hot, and the boy's voice rising and then breaking into something his mother heard differently from any other sound he had ever made, would test everything this woman was made of, and reveal something about the nature of her faith that was, if possible, even more extraordinary than the room she had built. There are moments in life when the very gift God gave you becomes the source of your deepest pain. And if you have ever held something precious in your hands, something you never asked for, something God placed in your life, like a sunrise you didn't deserve, and then watched it slip away, this chapter is written for you. The Shunammite woman had a son, not just any son, a miracle son, a child born from a womb that had given up hope, conceived through the word of a prophet, carried to term through the faithfulness of a God who keeps his promises even when biology says otherwise. Every morning she woke up and looked at that boy and saw the fingerprints of heaven on his face. Every laugh he gave was a sermon. Every step he took was a testimony. He was living proof that God had not forgotten her. And then one morning, everything changed. The boy ran out to the fields to be with his father during the harvest. Picture the scene. Golden wheat stretching to the horizon. Workers bending and rising in rhythm. The smell of cut grain in the hot summer air. The boy was young, full of energy. The kind of child who cannot sit still when there's a field to run through. He was alive. He was present. He was hers. And then he stopped. His hands went to his head. My head, he cried to his father. We don't know the exact medical cause. Some scholars suggest heat stroke. Others suggest a sudden aneurysm or severe migraine. But the text doesn't linger on the diagnosis. What the text captures is the speed and the weight of what happened next. The father, alarmed, told a servant to carry the boy to his mother. And so the child was brought back to the woman who had prayed for him, back to the woman who had built the room, back to the woman who had been told, at this time next year you shall embrace a son. She held him on her knees. Think about that image for a moment. She held him on her knees, not on a bed, not in a hospital, on her knees, as if she were already in a posture of prayer, as if her body instinctively knew that the only place to bring a dying child was into the arms of a mother who would not let go without a fight. He died at noon. There is something about the hour that feels deliberate in the text. Noon, the brightest hour of the day, the hour when the sun is highest and the shadows are shortest and the light is most unambiguous. There was no darkness to blame it on. There was no ambiguity about what had happened. In full daylight, with no warning and no preparation, the boy who had been her miracle became her grief. Now watch what she does, because this is where the Shunammite woman reveals a depth of faith that most of us will spend our entire lives trying to reach. She carried him upstairs, not to the guest room, not to her own bedroom. She carried him to Elisha's room, the room she had built with her own hands, the room she had furnished with a bed and a table and a lampstand and a stool, the room that had been designed as a place for the holy man to rest. She laid her dead son on the prophet's bed. Why? Why did she not lay him in his own room, or in her room? Why did she go all the way upstairs to the prophet's room? Because she was making a declaration. She was saying, without words, through action alone, "This child belongs to God. I am placing him back in the place where God's presence has rested. I am returning him to the source." She shut the door behind her. Then she went downstairs, found her husband, and said something extraordinary. She said, "Please send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys, that I may run to the man of God and come back." Her husband, confused, asked, "Why will you go to him today? It is neither the new moon nor the Sabbath." He didn't even know his son was dead. She hadn't told him. She was already moving, already focused, already running toward the solution before the problem had time to settle into permanence. And then these words. 4 words. 4 of the most powerful words in the entire Old Testament, spoken by a woman with a dead son in the room upstairs and a long road ahead of her. It will be all right. In Hebrew, the text uses the word shalom, peace, wholeness, completeness. She was not in denial. She was not pretending the pain wasn't real. She was making a prophetic declaration in the middle of devastation. She was choosing to speak the end of the story before she had seen it written. This is not prosperity theology. This is not the idea that if you have enough faith, nothing will ever go wrong. This is something far more raw and far more powerful. This is a woman who has stared directly into the worst moment of her life and decided that God's character is more reliable than her current circumstances. She did not shout. She did not weep publicly. She did not collapse. She saddled a donkey, told the servant to drive as fast as he could, and said, "Do not slow down the pace for me unless I tell you." She was going to find Elisha, because she knew, she had always known, even when she built that room and furnished it with such quiet, careful love, that the God who gives miracles does not abandon them halfway through the story. She had not asked for the son. She had not demanded anything. And when God had given her this gift and then allowed it to be taken, she did not curse the giver. She ran toward him. There is something in her posture that confronts every one of us who has ever received a blessing from God and then watched it be taken away. The job you worked so hard for, dissolved in a company restructuring. The relationship you prayed over for years, ending without explanation. The health you assumed was stable, suddenly diagnosed. The child you loved completely, taken too soon. In every one of those moments, there are 2 responses available. You can sit down in the grief and decide that God's silence means God's absence. Or you can do what this woman did, acknowledge the pain without letting the pain become your conclusion. Get on the donkey and ride toward the one who started the story. She did not know how it would end. She had no promise of resurrection. Elisha had never raised the dead before. This was unprecedented territory. But she ran anyway, because her faith was not based on a predictable outcome. Her faith was based on an unshakable relationship. It will be all right. She said it before she had any evidence. She said it because she believed that the God who had written the first chapter of her miracle had not finished the manuscript. And she was right. But before we see the resolution, we need to sit in this chapter for a moment longer. Because the spiritual lesson here is not just about running to God in crisis. It is about what she did before the crisis, the years of quiet faithfulness, the room she built without applause, the meals she prepared without recognition, the hospitality she offered without calculating the return. She had been building, in obscurity, a relationship with the presence of God. And when the worst day of her life arrived, she didn't have to start from scratch. She already knew where to run. You are building something right now. In your daily prayers, in your small acts of faithfulness, in the quiet room, you prepare for God. In your heart, you are building the infrastructure that will hold you together when the world falls apart. Don't stop building. Gehazi saw her coming from a distance. Elisha had sent him out to meet her, the prophet, attuned to the presence of God, with the kind of sensitivity that only comes from years of solitude and surrender, had felt something wrong. Run at once to meet her, he told Gehazi. Ask her, is all well with you? Is all well with your husband? Is all well with the child? And Gehazi ran. And when he met her on the road, with Mount Carmel in the distance and the afternoon sun heavy on the hills, he asked exactly what Elisha had told him to ask. She said, all is well. She said it again, Shalom. She did not tell Gehazi the truth, not because she was lying, but because Gehazi was not the one she had come to see. Her answer was not a report. It was a boundary. She was not going to pour out the story of her dead son to the servant when the prophet was still ahead of her. There are moments when we need to be careful about who we bring our grief to. Not every person who asks, how are you, is equipped to carry the answer. The Shunammite woman had discernment. She knew the difference between a sympathetic ear and an actual source of help. She said, all is well, and kept walking. When she reached Elisha, when she finally came to the man who had spoken the word that brought the child into existence, she fell at his feet. Gehazi stepped forward to push her away. This was protocol. You didn't just grab the feet of a holy man. But Elisha stopped him. Leave her alone, for she is in bitter distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. What a remarkable admission. The prophet, the man of God, the one who had called down fire and parted the Jordan and spoken the word of life over her womb, he didn't know. God had not briefed him on the situation. He was as surprised as anyone. This is deeply important because it tells us that Elisha's power was not based on omniscience. He was not always in the loop. He was not a person who walked through life with a supernatural hotline that gave him advance notice of every crisis. He was a man, a remarkable man, a man of extraordinary faith and surrender, but still a man who sometimes had to encounter the problem before he understood it. And yet she came to him anyway, because she knew that even if Elisha didn't have the information, he had access to the one who did. She cried out, did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I not say, do not deceive me? This is the only moment of raw anger in the text, and it is stunning in its honesty. She was not accusing God of malice. She was laying her confusion on the table. I never asked for this. You gave it to me. You started this. And now why? Why did you start a story you weren't going to finish? It is one of the most honest prayers in the entire Bible. Not eloquent, not structured, just raw, unfiltered, bewildered love talking directly to the source of its pain. Elisha's response was immediate. He told Gehazi to take his staff, run ahead, and lay it on the child's face. He gave specific instructions. Don't greet anyone on the road. Don't stop for conversation. Go directly to the boy and place the staff on his face. Gehazi obeyed. He ran ahead. He placed the staff. Nothing happened. The text is matter-of-fact about it. There was no sound or sign of life. Gehazi ran back to Elisha and reported, the child has not awakened. This detail is extraordinary. The first attempt didn't work. The tool that Elisha used, his own staff, an object associated with his authority and ministry, produced no result. And this invites a profound question. Why did God not allow the staff to work? Perhaps because the miracle required presence not proxy. Perhaps because some crises cannot be resolved by sending someone else in your place. Perhaps because this particular moment required Elisha himself to go, to get down on the floor, to stretch himself over the child, to pray with his body as well as his voice. Some battles require your personal presence. You cannot delegate the prayer. You cannot outsource the surrender. You cannot send a representative into the room where God is waiting for you specifically. Elisha arrived. He went into the room, his room, the room she had built, the room furnished with the bed and the table and the lampstand and the stool. He shut the door. It was just him and the child and God. He prayed. And then he did something strange. He got down on the child, stretched himself over the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. He made himself small to fit the shape of the child. He breathed. He got up, walked back and forth across the room, and then stretched himself over the child again. 7 times, 7 sneezes, and the boy opened his eyes. But we are not yet at the resurrection. We are still in the chapter before. We are still in the place where she has done everything right and nothing has changed yet. We are still on the road. We are still running. We are still in the ache between what was and what will be. And this is the place where most of us actually live. Not in the miracle, not in the before, in the in-between. In the chapter where you have laid the problem in the prophet's room and shut the door and gotten on the donkey, and you are riding hard toward the answer and you don't know yet what the answer will be. The spiritual discipline of this chapter is not heroism. It is persistence. It is continuing to move when you have no guarantee. It is speaking peace over a situation that looks like anything but peace. It is knowing where to go and going there, even when the first attempt doesn't produce the result. She had built the room. She had served the prophet. She had spoken the blessing of peace over her husband when her heart was breaking. She had ridden hard to find Elisha. She had fallen at his feet in honest, unashamed need. She had not given up, and God had seen every step. The miracle was not lost. It was waiting. It was waiting for the right moment, the right obedience, the right presence. It was waiting for Elisha to come down off the mountain of distance and enter the intimate, personal, flesh-to-flesh encounter with a broken thing that needed to be made whole. That is what God does with our grief. He doesn't fix it from a distance. He comes down. He makes himself small. He breathes his life into the dead places. He stays until the sneezes come. He always comes down. Elisha stretched himself over the child. Let that image settle for a moment. The prophet of God, the man who had called down fire, who had parted the Jordan with his cloak, who had spoken the word that brought this very child into existence, got down on the floor and made himself the same size as a dead boy. This is the posture of resurrection. It is not towering. It is not dramatic. It is intimate and low and costly. And it tells us something essential about the way God works in the deepest, broken places of our lives. The boy's body was cold. Whatever heat had been there at noon was gone. Gehazi's staff had produced nothing. The room was silent. And yet Elisha did not turn back. He got down, and he stayed down, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. Every point of contact was deliberate. The breath, the most fundamental evidence of life, transferred from prophet to child. The eyes, the windows through which light enters, aligned. The hands, the instruments of both labor and blessing, placed over the small, still hands of the boy. In Hebrew thought, this kind of contact was not merely physical. It was covenantal. It was the act of one being pouring its vitality into another, refusing to acknowledge the boundary between the living and the dead as final. Elisha was not performing a medical procedure. He was making a declaration with his body. This death is not the last word. I have come from the God of life, and the God of life has not finished with this child." The child's body began to grow warm. Elisha stood up and walked back and forth across the room. There is something almost human and restless about that detail. He was not calm. He was not distant. He was pacing the way a father paces in a waiting room, the way a person paces when the outcome matters too much to stand still. He was engaged. He was all in. Then he stretched himself over the child again. The boy sneezed. Once, twice, 3 times. The body convulsing back into the rhythm of breath. The lungs forcing air through passages that had been still for hours. 4, 5, 6, and then 7. 7 sneezes. And then the boy opened his eyes. 7 is not an accidental number in this text. Throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, 7 represents completeness, fullness, the wholeness of divine action. 6 sneezes would have been remarkable. 7 sneezes declared that the restoration was total, not partial, not provisional, not a halfway miracle, but a complete return to life. The boy opened his eyes, not gradually, not with confusion. He opened his eyes, and there was Elisha looking down at him, having just breathed his own breath into his lungs, having just stayed when staying was costly, having just refused to accept death as the final verdict. Elisha called Gehazi. "Call this Shunammite." He didn't go to her himself, not because he was dismissing her, but because he understood that the moment of reunion belonged to her. He had done his part. This moment was hers. She came. She came into the room she had built. She walked through the door she had shut in grief. She stood before the prophet, who had stretched himself over her son's body. And Elisha said, "Pick up your son." She fell at his feet and bowed herself to the ground. The text does not record a speech. There is no elaborate prayer of thanksgiving, no eloquent testimony, just a woman on the floor, her face to the ground, overwhelmed beyond words. And then she picked up her son and carried him out. This is the moment the entire chapter has been building to. This is the reason she laid him in the prophet's room. This is the reason she said, "It will be all right," when there was no visible reason to believe it. This is the return on every act of quiet faithfulness she had ever offered: the meals, the room, the bed, and the table, and the lampstand, and the stool. God had not wasted a single detail. But let us pause here and resist the temptation to make this story simpler than it is. Because the resurrection of the Shunammite son was not the inevitable result of her faith. Faith does not always produce resurrection. There are mothers who prayed with the same desperation, the same persistence, the same shalom on their lips, and their children did not come back. There are people who built rooms for God's presence and served faithfully for decades and still received suffering instead of miracles. The Shunammite story is not a formula. It is not a vending machine theology, where if you insert enough faith and perform enough acts of service, the miracle dispenses automatically. It is a window, a particular, specific, unrepeatable window into the character of a God who is capable of resurrection, who is not bound by death, who can reverse what appears to be final. And the invitation of this chapter is not, "Do what she did and your miracle will come." The invitation is deeper and harder and more beautiful than that. The invitation is, hold on to the God who raised the dead, even when he hasn't raised yours yet. Build the room anyway. Speak the peace anyway. Ride toward the presence of God anyway, not because you have been promised this particular outcome, but because you have chosen to trust the character of the one who holds every outcome. The 7 sneezes are not just the climax of one woman's story. They are a declaration written into the architecture of Scripture that death is not permanent when God decides otherwise. And one day in a garden, with a stone rolled away and a folded linen cloth left behind, that declaration would be made not just for one child in one room, but for every human being who has ever died and longed for mourning. The Shunammite woman prefigures the resurrection. Her son, raised from the prophet's bed, prefigures the son raised from the tomb. And the room she built, that quiet, obscure, carefully furnished upper room, prefigures the upper room, where the Spirit would descend like fire and breathe life into an entirely new kind of people. She did not know all of this when she was picking out the lampstand. She did not know when she was asking her husband for a small addition to the house that she was participating in a story bigger than her own lifetime. Neither do you. The room you are building right now in prayer, in faithfulness, in the quiet acts of love that nobody notices, is part of a story that extends far beyond what you can currently see. And when the sneezes come, you will understand why every detail mattered. Years passed after the resurrection. The Shunammite woman continued to live in her house in Shunem, in the hill country of Ephraim, with her husband and her miracle son, and the quiet faithfulness that had defined her from the beginning. She did not write a book about what had happened. She did not start a ministry. She did not build a platform or develop a brand or monetize her testimony. She simply lived. But there is one more scene in her story, a scene that comes much later, after Elisha has died and the political landscape of Israel has shifted, and it is perhaps the most underrated moment in the entire narrative. God had warned Elisha of a coming 7-year famine, and Elisha warned the Shunammite woman to leave her land and live wherever she could find provision. She obeyed. She packed up, took her son, and left. For 7 years she lived as a foreigner in the land of the Philistines, a woman without home, without land, without the physical anchor of the place where her miracle had happened. And then the famine ended, and she came back. Her land had been taken over. In her absence, the property she had left behind had been claimed, and she had to go to the king to appeal for its return. She went to the palace. She stood before the king. And here is the extraordinary detail that the biblical narrator clearly intends for us to notice at the exact moment she arrived in the throne room. Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, was telling the king about the Shunammite woman. He was in the middle of recounting the story of her son's resurrection when she walked through the door. The king looked up. He saw her standing there. He saw her son standing beside her, the son Gehazi had just been describing, the son who had been dead and was now alive. And the king restored everything to her, not just her land, but all the produce of the field from the moment she had left. She lost nothing, not a single day's harvest, not a single year of provision. Everything that had been taken in her absence was returned, and everything that the land had produced while she was gone was given back to her in full. This is the final word of her story, and it is magnificent in its completeness. The God who remembered her quiet hospitality, who rewarded her careful room building, who raised her dead son through the hands of his prophet, that same God arranged the timing of history so that at the very moment she needed her voice to be heard, the one person in the kingdom who knew her full story was already in the room, already telling it, already preparing the ground for her restoration. She didn't even have to explain herself. She just had to show up. There is a principle here that runs deeper than any single story. It is the principle of divine remembrance. It is the principle that God does not forget what is built in obscurity. He does not overlook the unnamed acts of faithfulness, the meals prepared without applause, the rooms furnished without recognition, the prayers whispered in empty houses in the middle of the night. The world's economy operates on visibility. In a world of platforms and algorithms and engagement metrics, we have been trained to believe that what is not seen does not count. that if there is no audience, there is no value, that the obscure act of faithfulness, the anonymous donation, the prayer that no one knows you prayed, the kindness that left no digital footprint, these things disappear into the void, unrewarded and unremembered. But the kingdom of God operates on a completely different economy. In the kingdom, what is built in secret is remembered publicly. What is given without calculation is returned with abundance. What is sown in obscurity is harvested in the fullness of time. The Shunammite woman did not furnish Elish's room because she expected a return on investment. She did it because she had discerned the presence of a holy man and wanted to honor that presence. She did it out of love. She did it out of reverence. She did it out of the kind of generous attentiveness that cannot be manufactured by strategy, only grown by a heart that has learned to see what God values. And God saw it, and God stored it, and God returned it. Think about the moments in your own life when you have served without recognition. The hospital visit that nobody knew you made. The check you wrote to a need that never made the announcement board. The years of faithful prayer for someone who never knew you were praying. The marriage you kept working at when it would have been easier to walk away. The job you did with integrity when nobody was watching. The child you raised in a broken world with whatever tools you had. You think those moments are invisible. You think they are small. You think the algorithm has already moved on. But there is a record being kept that is not subject to the metrics of this age. There is a king before whom the whole story is being told in its fullness. And when you walk into the room, when you show up at the moment of your need, in the fullness of your history, you will find that someone has already been telling your story. You will find that nothing was lost. The Shunammite woman's story ends not with a miracle, but with a restoration. And that is perhaps the most encouraging thing of all. Because miracles are extraordinary, by definition, they are the exceptions that prove the rule. But restoration is different. Restoration is the long arc of God's faithfulness bending back toward wholeness. Restoration is the 7 years of famine and the 7 years of harvest in the king, who looks up and sees you standing in the doorway and says, "Give back everything that was hers." You may be in your 7 years right now. You may be in your Philistine season, displaced from where you belong, living on borrowed ground, waiting for the famine to end. You may have left the place of your miracle in order to survive the drought, and you may wonder if you will ever get back to where your story began. You will, not because you have earned it, not because your faith has been perfect or your obedience has been complete, but because the God who started the story, the God who noticed a woman in a small town in the hill country and sent his prophet to walk past her door, is the same God who arranges the timing of throne rooms and the content of conversations. And the moment when your need walks through the door at the exact moment your testimony is being told. He is the God of the lampstand in the quiet room. He is the God of the 7 sneezes. He is the God who makes himself small enough to breathe life into what is dead, and great enough to move kings on your behalf. Build the room, serve the presence, speak the peace, ride toward the answer when the crisis comes. Stay at his feet until you have what you need. And when the famine ends, come home, because what you have built in obscurity, God is remembering right now. And what he remembers, he restores. Nothing is lost in his keeping. Nothing.